Hi, this is going to be my second tutorial on jsPsych. This one's going to be aimed more at the beginner level. I'm going to try to explain what I'm doing for some of the foundational steps a little more clearly. And at the same time, the task that we're setting up in this experiment is going to be a dichotic listening task. So it's kind of an unusual use case of jsPsych. So hopefully you can learn some new things even if you're an experienced user and you're just looking for some tips. So the dichotic listening task is a task where participants have headphones on and they're hearing one thing in their right ear and another thing in their left ear. And in this task, what we're going to be doing is playing one word in their left ear and another word in their right ear and asking them to write down all the things that they hear in the task. And we're looking for whether there's an advantage for processing left hemisphere language versus right hemisphere language. So to get started, we're going to download the latest version of jsPsych. So if you're at the jsPsych website, probably the fastest way to get there is to click on this link to GitHub in the top right corner. And that will take you to the GitHub repository for jsPsych, which hosts all of the code. You can click this releases icon right in the middle. And just scroll down to the bottom of the latest release. And in this case, it's jsPsych 6.1.0. And you can just click this zip file right here. And that will download. And then what you'll want to do is create a folder somewhere to host your experiment or to house your experiment. And I've just got that on my desktop. It's called Dichotic Listening. It's got nothing in it so far. So I'm going to open this zip file that's got jsPsych 6.1 in it. And I'm going to copy the jsPsych, the plugins, and the CSS. The examples folder has a lot of examples in it that are really nice if you're looking for templates to work from or just looking to understand how different plugins work. But you don't really need to include those with your experiment. So I'm just not going to copy them. Okay, I'm going to close that. And I am going to, let's see, leave that there for now. Okay. Inside this folder, we will need to create an HTML document to host our experiment. I'm going to open this folder with my sort of programming-friendly text editor, which is Visual Studio Code. So if this is one of your first times programming, you will want to get some kind of programming-friendly text editor. I really like Visual Studio Code, but there's lots of other good choices out there too. And there's lots of really good free options, including VS Code. So you can Google how to download that, of course. Okay, so once I've got the folder open in here, which you can see on the left, I'm going to create a file that I'm going to call index.html. On the web, index.html files are the files that display by default if your user types in like a folder name. So if you have your website hosted at www.myexperiment.com and there you have an index.html file, they don't need to add anything to myexperiment.com. It'll just automatically go to index.html. If your experiment file was named experiment.html, then they would have to go to myexperiment.com/experiment.html. So this is just one way to make the URL a little bit shorter. Okay, any HTML document has some basic markup. And so I'm not going to be giving an HTML tutorial here, but I will just briefly describe kind of the things you might need to know to get started if this is one of your first times working with HTML. So HTML has this structure. It's got this first tag at the beginning that just tells the browser what kind of document we're working with. It's got this HTML section where you usually put sort of everything in. Then there's usually two main sections. There's a head, and the head section is where you can load in script files, for example, or is just conventionally where you do that. So I'm going to load in the jsPsych.js file with this script tag. And this just tells the experiment page to include jsPsych.js in this website, and so we can use all the jsPsych functions. It's actually occurring to me that I think what I should do before I get too much further is change the structure just a little bit. I'm going to make a folder here I'm going to call this JSPsych-6.1.0. And I'm just going to move all of the JSPsych related things into that folder. And that I think just helps with a little bit of organization. So now you can see over here, this is all nested in a folder. It does mean that we have to change our path. So we just have to add that folder name here. And now we've got everything set up nicely. Okay, when you're using JSPsych, you always have to load the jspsych.js file that contains the sort of main engine of JSPsych for running experiments. And then there are these optional plugin files, and there's 30-something of them that are included in the release, and they're also pretty straightforward to customize once you get comfortable with JavaScript. So this is a nice way to sort of organize your code for different kinds of tasks that you might be running. So what we need to do is pick the kinds of plugins that we're going to need for this task, and then load those into the page. And if you don't really know what the plugins are, because you're not familiar with JSPsych yet, the jspsych.org website has a list of every single plugin that's included in the release and a description about them. And that examples folder that you downloaded in the release also contains at least one working example for every single plugin too. So you can just go through the examples and see what the plugins do. For this experiment, we're going to need a plugin to play audio files. So there's a few here at the top. There's audio button response, audio keyboard response, audio slider response. So these are all plugins that play audio, but then have the user respond in different ways. In this particular experiment, we actually want the user to respond by typing something into a text box. And we're going to accomplish that by having two plugins sequentially. So we're going to use the keyboard response plugin to play the audio file. And then we are going to use the survey text plugin to actually get the response. And then we'll also probably need to have some instructions show up on the screen. And there's a few different plugins you can use. There's actually one called instructions. That one is nice if you have like very long instructions that you want to do and you want to give some options for how to navigate those. For really brief instructions, I actually usually just use the HTML keyboard response, or even the maybe the best thing here is the button response. This will allow people to see some text and then click a button that says, okay, I got it, and move on to the next screen. Finally, the last thing that is worth loading is the style sheet. And this is, programming for the web is kind of weird because there are really three languages that you have to learn. There's HTML, this markup language that you use to describe sort of the structure of a website and do things like load scripts and things like that. There's also CSS, cascading style sheets. And this is a markup language that lets you control the visual appearance of the website. So how big are things on the screen, what font, what color, etc. That's all controlled through CSS. So JSPsych comes with a default style sheet that is, it does some pretty minimal things. It has a nice font for that is universally accessible to anybody with a web browser. It does things like center the content on the screen by default. So that's nice because otherwise the content would all show up in the top left corner. And so this just keeps everything kind of basic, but it doesn't do anything fancy. And you can always add to it if you want to do something custom for your experiment, like say have a particular color background or particular color font. So the tag for loading in a style sheet is a link tag, and you have to give it what kind of link it is, the rel property, and also a link to the actual CSS file, which is in this folder right here. Okay, so that's our head section. Then there's a body section, and this is usually where you'd put all the content for your website, but actually JSPsych is going to generate all that for us, so we just need an empty body for JSPsych to work on. And then finally, we're going to create another script tag, but this time it's going to be at the bottom of our document, and this is where we are going to do all of our programming in JavaScript, which is the third language of the web. And JavaScript is a fully featured programming language that lets you not just do sort of standard programming things, but also interact directly with HTML and with CSS to control what's on the screen and also to control how it looks. So when you build a JSPsych experiment, the thing that you are constructing is a timeline. And the timeline describes how the experiment will, like the order of trials that will unfold over the course of the experiment. And in jsPsych, a timeline is an array. So in JavaScript, you declare an array with the open and close brackets. And then we will create trials to add to this timeline, and then we will add them on to the timeline with a line of code. So just to get started, let's make a quick welcome screen. One of the things that to be aware of when you're working with audio data is that browsers now have a feature that a website can't play audio until somebody's interacted with the website. So if your first trial is an audio trial, that actually won't work. Participants won't be able to hear it. You have to have them click on something or hit a key before they can hear any audio. And this is to prevent like really annoying pop-ups that play music or ads at you. So it's a good feature, but it is a little bit annoying for developing experiments. Okay, so to create this welcome screen, we're going to use the HTML button response plugin. So we create a variable, and then this variable is an object. And in JavaScript, objects are denoted with the bracket notation. So it's an open bracket and a closed bracket. And then you can set a list of keys or properties of the object. So here we're going to have a key or property called type. And then the value is going to be the name of the plugin that we want to use. So this is a HTML button response. And then every plugin has different parameters that you can set to control its appearance. And a full list of the options for each plugin is available on the jsPsych website. So for the button response plugin, the main parameter that we are interested in is something called stimulus. And here we can just say, welcome to the experiment. And we can adjust this later on. Notice that I'm including a little bit of HTML in this stimulus. So this is a paragraph tag. So this just denotes welcome to the experiment as a chunk of text that hangs together as a paragraph. You don't necessarily have to do this, but it is nice to be able to add markup to the stimulus and control exactly how it looks. Then the other parameter that we need is something called choices, and this gives us the labels for our buttons. So we're going to create an array. We're only going to have one button here, so there's only going to be one entry in the array. Let's see, and then we'll just call this continue. Okay, once we've got a trial created like this, we can add it to our timeline. So there's a lot of ways you can add things to arrays, but if you're just trying to add one item on, a very simple method is timeline.push welcome screen. And this just takes this object and adds it on to this timeline. So now we have an array with one item in it. That's this welcome screen. And then just for demonstration, the final thing we can do here is launch the experiment. So we do that by calling jsPsych init. And we have to pass it this function, an object with all of the options we want to set for this particular experiment. The only option that you ever have to set is the timeline. So we're going to say the timeline option is just the variable timeline. And I'm going to save this file. And hopefully I've done everything correctly. And if I open this in my browser, yep, we get this welcome to the experiment with a continue button. And if I hit this continue button, nothing will happen, or the trial will end, but then nothing happens after that because that's the end of the experiment. Okay, let's go back to the code. So now let's go ahead and we can start thinking about a single trial of audio and with a response. And once we have that single trial working, then we'll think about how to scale it up so that we get all 32 trials is how many we're going to run in this particular experiment. So I'm going to make another trial called audio trial. And the type of this trial is going to be audio keyboard response. And my stimulus is going to be a path to an audio file, but I don't actually have any audio files loaded here. So I'm going to go get my audio files. I went and I downloaded the audio files. Should have done that before I started recording. Sorry about that. But I went and got them. They are in a folder now. I'll show you. So in my Dichotic listening experiment folder, I added a folder called MP3. And in there, I have 32 audio files. Each of these audio files has 2 words being spoken simultaneously, one in the right ear and one in the left ear. So these are stereo tracks that have sort of two different sounds playing in 2 different ears. So the first one, for example, has cat being played in the right ear and fall being played in the left ear. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just do one of these. So I'm going to say MP3. So we're going to give the path to the file, and that path is relative to where the index.html file is. So we have to go into the MP3 folder, and then we have to get 1_cat_r_fall_l.mp3. And by the way, if you're following along and you're trying to build this experiment with me, I will have the links to the MP3 files will be available on GitHub, so you'll be able to download all of these from GitHub from the tutorial that'll be linked in the video description on YouTube. Okay, so I've got the stimulus, I've got the path to it, and we actually don't need to do anything else to get it to play. But at the end of this trial, we aren't really interested in the person responding with the key here. We just want to use this plugin to play the sound. So one thing we can do is set the choices, the options that the user has to respond, to this special value jsPsych.noKeys, which means the participant cannot respond during the trial. And then we can say trial ends after audio, true. And this will terminate the trial and move on to the next trial as soon as the audio file finishes playing. Okay, then let's add a response trial. And for the response trial, we're going to use the survey text plugin. And the survey text plugin, we can take a look at it because I don't remember off the top of my head exactly how to structure this. So if you click survey text, you get some, this isn't really meant as documentation. This is actually something that jsPsych uses internally to help it figure out what parameters are available. But you can take a look here and see, okay, what are the parameters that are available? Well, there's one called questions, and that has some parameters nested under it. And then there's a parameter called preamble and a parameter called button label. So what we want here is questions, and each question that we show on the page, we're only going to show one, will have a prompt, I believe. Let me double check that. So nested prompt, okay. Prompt. And this can just be, please write down any words that you heard. If you heard more than one word, please separate each word with a comma. Okay. And I think the default size of that text box should be okay. So we probably don't need to tweak anything there. And let's go ahead and push both of these trials onto the timeline. So timeline.push audio trial. Timeline.push response trial. Okay, and we've already got the experiment initialized. Now I'm going to run this, but it's not going to work, and I'm going to show you an error that you might see, and I'll explain why you get this error. So this is so the experiment fails to load. So what's going on here? Well, the problem is that the way that audio files are loaded by browsers, you actually can't load them using the default method that jsPsych uses if you're not running on a web server or if you haven't disabled certain security features of your browser. So there's a security feature that prevents you from loading audio files in a particular kind of way. And that's the way that jsPsych does by default because it's the best way to present them. However, if you're not really care, if you don't really care about super precise response times related to the onset of audio files, you don't really need to use this particular way, and then you don't need to worry about this security feature. By the way, one way to diagnose what's going on here is all browsers have some kind of developer tools that will let you look at sort of debug what's going on. So if you do more tools, developer tools on Chrome, you'll get useful error messages. So here we get this message that the origin has been blocked by this cross-origin request policy, and we can't. Basically, this is what I was saying before. It's a security feature that blocks loading it, and it tries to load it several times because jsPsych has a built-in mechanism for repeated loading if something fails to load, just in case it's due to like a server outage for a moment. Okay, so what's the fix? Well, one fix is to disable security features on your browser. The other feature is to you can tell jsPsych to not use the fancy web audio API. You can say use web audio false, and that will switch it to the default HTML5 audio, which works perfectly well, but is slightly less precise in terms of timing. So now if we refresh this page, now no problem. We get this warning about the audio context was not allowed to start, but as soon as you click this button, the user will interact with the page and the audio will be allowed to start. So we can, okay, so that's probably weird. Even if you're wearing headphones, I don't think the recording software that I'm using is actually gonna translate that correctly. I'm not sure about that, but you could hear the audio. So the audio trial worked, and now we get our response trial. So we could type in a response, and then we could hit continue, and that ends our experiment. Okay, so now we want to scale this experiment up to all 32 trials. So one way that you could do this would be to copy these trials 32 times, and you could just change the stimulus value manually. And that would be fine, and sort of the simplest way to do it. But it doesn't let you do things like easily randomize the order of trials, or it's also just kind of a pain to have the same thing over and over again. So jsPsych has this nice feature called timeline variables. And what timeline variables allow you to do is you can specify a sort of a procedure that repeats on a timeline. So here the audio trial and the response trial. And then we can, instead of having like a particular value for the stimulus, we can have a variable that is substituted in so that it runs through the same procedure multiple times, but with a different value for a particular parameter each time. So we're going to go ahead and create some timeline variables. So I'm going to call this, well, we can call it, I guess we can just call it timeline variables. And that's going to be an array. And this array is going to have one entry for every distinct trial that we want to run. And each trial is going to be an object. So the object will have whatever properties you want. So we could call it sound. And then that would be this value right here. And then another thing that we could do is we could try to do some automated scoring here of participants' responses. So right now we have the sort of what audio file was played in the left and in the right ear, and then we just have these open-ended responses. It would be nice if we could have some indication of like whether the participant was correct or not. That's just naturally recorded in the data file. And in order to do that, we have to tell jsPsych which things are playing so that we can later, I'll show you how to check that in the data file itself. So I'm going to do left as a variable, and some of our words are going to have homophones. So I am going to make it an array so we can specify multiple valid options. So cat for left, and for right, it's going to be fall. And then the next trial, we could just copy this, and we could add another line after this. And let's go back over to our list of MP3s. And then we would just change this to be the next thing. So dog and win. So we do dog, win, left, dog, right, win, and so on. I've already done this ahead of time so that you don't have to sit through it. I'm just going to grab that and paste it in. I've now pasted in my pre-written timeline variables. So just to quickly orient again here, I've got the sound file, I've got the word that's played to the left ear and the word that's played to the right ear. Sometimes there are multiple valid words that you might spell for the thing that you heard, so those are listed as separate options. Also note that the first 16 trials all are unique, but then the second 16 trials are the exact same things with just the ears swapped. So actually what starts as left being first here becomes right down here, and order is irrelevant here. So it's just an easier way to quickly write this down in the editor. Okay, so now we've got 32 trials that we can go through, and we need to now create the timeline that we're going to use to repeat these trials over and over again. So we already have the foundation of that. We have the audio trial and the response trial, and now we need to create what I'm going to call the test procedure, and that is going to have its own timeline. So, timeline. And on that timeline is going to be the audio trial and the response trial. So essentially what this is doing is creating like a timeline within the main timeline, and this sub timeline has the audio and response trial on it. And then we will say timeline variables for this particular procedure is the variable called timeline variables. Now, in order to use these timeline variables, we have to tell jsPsych where to substitute these values in. So really the main one here is the stimulus value, jsPsych.timeline variable, and then we give it the name. So what this says is for the value of stimulus, find the timeline variable that's called sound and use whatever value is currently the value for that trial in the stimulus parameter. Okay, so that'll work. This will work. We'll deal with this left-right thing in a minute. And the last thing that we should do is we should tell jsPsych to preload all of these audio files. Now, in some cases, jsPsych will do preloading for you, but one of the cases where it can't do preloading for you yet is when you're using a file in a timeline variable. It's not, the preloading mechanism is not quite smart enough to figure out that these files need to be preloaded. So what we need to do is copy all of these file names, and it's going to get a little messy here. But I'm going to, in our jsPsych init method, one of the things we can specify is preload audio, and then we can give it an array of audio files to preload. Now this is kind of a mess, but I think what we can quickly do through the magic of video editing is delete all of the extra crap, and we will get down to just the file names. Okay, editing complete. And now we've got an array that we are passing in all of the files that we need to preload to jsPsych, and it will now load those audio files up at the start of the experiment and be ready to play them when we get to the trial. The final piece here is we should delete this timeline.push, because now the audio is actually going to be on this test procedure. So we're going to delete this, and we're going to delete this. And now these trials don't exist on the main timeline, but they do exist on this sub timeline. And then we do have to add to the main timeline, we have to add the test procedure timeline. So now we've got this test procedure directly on the main timeline. And what will happen here when we play this is that it will repeat this process, this timeline here, audio trial, response trial, it will repeat it 32 times, and it will repeat it in order. So it'll do this trial, and then it'll do this trial, and then it'll do this trial, and so on until it gets to this trial, and then only then will it be done. So we can just see the start of that to make sure it's working. I'm going to minimize this and open. So that progress bar at the beginning was just a indicator for the preloading of the experiment. Oh, yep, there was the first one. I don't remember what it is. I don't have headphones in, so I can't really tell the difference.
Dog.
Heard dog, so I'll put dog in.
More.
Heard more.
Nev.
And so on. So we can see that this is now working. We've got 30. Well, this will happen 32 times, and then the experiment would just end. Okay. So obviously, we don't want to run these in the same order necessarily every time. I guess that's not obvious. There might be cases where you do want to run this in the same order. But in this case, we probably don't want to run them in the same order every time. So we probably want to randomize the order of this. And that's really easy when you have timeline variables. All you have to do is on the timeline where you're using those variables, you add another option, randomize order true. And now these 32 items will be played in a random order each time. What we could also do is potentially divide this up into 2 blocks, but let's get it working. So where the second block is all of these trials, and the first block is all of these, since those are the same words. We might want to spread those out a little bit in the experiment. Okay, so the last thing, and this is kind of one of the more advanced things that we might do in this tutorial, is we could try to record how accurate the participant was. So right now, if we were to, let's see if I can show you, I'm going to open up those developer tools again. And there's this console. Yeah, this error sometimes pops up here. It doesn't seem to be a critical error. We will patch it eventually. So if we want to look at the data that JSPsych is collecting, we can do jspsych.data.get, and we can look at it in a couple different formats. One format would be like a CSV. So right now, it's a little hard to see in this particular way, but you can see there's a column called response time, another column called stimulus, what button was pressed, what kind of trial it was, and so on. And then there's this thing at the end here, responses, and that's where you can see, like, here's my response. I wrote dog, I wrote more, and what we would want to make sure is that all of the data that we need is in each row here. So for example, here's the row when I responded dog. And one of the things that's missing in this row is what the actual words were that were presented, because that is only contained in the row before. And if you're thinking about analyzing your data in some kind of standard R-based way or Python-based way where you're trying to do row-based processing, it would be kind of annoying to have to merge this row with this one after the fact. And instead, what we can do is add data directly onto here that indicates the value at that particular moment in the trial. One way that we can add information about the trial to this response option, what sound was playing during the trial, is through the data parameter. And this is a parameter that's available no matter what plugin you're using. It's always available. And it allows you to tag a trial with additional data. So here we could tag the trial with what sound was playing. So we could say jspsych.timeline variable sound. And what this will do is it'll take this string here that's got the particular values that we're playing in that trial, and it will just add a column in our CSV or in our data representation that says, okay, in this trial, this is the sound that was playing. We might also want to just add some additional things here. So we could say, we could, if we want to be able to quickly like filter our data so that we're only looking at the trials where people responded, it can be helpful to add a column that just indicates that this is a response phase of the experiment, for example. And then that would allow you to say, filter your data very quickly to all rows that contain the phase being response. And then, yeah, that should be good for tagging our data. And then we might also want to do something that's a little more advanced, which is to actually indicate whether subjects got the response correct or not. Now, it's not going to be perfect because we can't really catch typos very easily, but at least we can get a quick and dirty approximation of whether we think that the subject's response was accurate. And the way to do that is with a parameter that's also available for all plugins called onFinish. And what onFinish lets you do is specify a function that you can run after the subject has completed the trial. And that function will get the data from that trial. So we can do some processing on the data. So what we'll do is we will extract the response that the participant gave. And that's going to be stored in this data object. And it's going to be in this property of this data object called data.responses, I believe. We can double check that in a second. This is in the documentation. So every plugin on jsPsych.org is described with what kind of data or what the name of the data is that it's stored in. And actually, we can just quickly peek at the plugin file, and we should be able to see this. Yeah, so here's this trial data that's being saved, and it's called responses right there. Okay, so we can say subject responses or subject response. And now this data.responses is stored as a JSON string. So this is a string-based representation of an array. And what we want to do, or an object in this case, and we want to parse that. So we're going to call json.parse data.responses. And then there's only one question on the page. So the object that we want is Q0. If you had multiple text questions on a page, then the response to the first one would be Q0 and then Q1 and then Q2. You can also specify the name, so you can like label your text fields with different names so that it's not Q0, but it's like dot, I don't know, ID or something like that, or name, or name is terrible name because that's the name that I'm trying to say, and this is now completely ambiguous. Anyways, moving on. So we have the subject response for Q0. And that should just be the string that's got the different responses that we have. And what we want to do is we want to see if that response exists is either the in the right or in the left. So we should probably clean this up a little bit. So we're going to say subject response dot to lowercase. So we're going to make sure that everything is lowercase. Let me make sure that that's the right function to use because I don't remember off the top of my head. We can use the JavaScript console here to figure this out. So let's make a string that's capitalized. We do to lowercase. So I just need to capitalize here. So we can do subject response dot to lowercase with a capital C. And we'll say lowercase response. So once we have the lowercase response, we can split that up into the individual responses. So we can do lowercase, let's see, we're going to do subject response words is lowercase response dot split. And this is the function that will let you divide up the response. Wherever there's a comma, it'll now create an array. So if subject says, they say they heard both hug and roll, and they wrote hug, comma, roll, then this would split the response into an array where the first element is hug and the second element is roll. Okay, and then we want to check if the responses that the subject gave are in either the right or in the left list that we have. So we can say we have to iterate through each of these. So we can do it with a for loop. So we can say for I equals 0, I less than subject response words dot length I plus plus. Okay, then we can say, let's see. So we can say if the sub, or let's actually do it as a, let's do var word equals subject response words I. This is just a little bit of clarity. We're going to trim this, which will remove any extra white space on either side of the word. And now we've got the word, so we can compare it to the right and the left words in this timeline variables up here. So we can say if jsPsych.timeline variable right, and because we are in a, this is kind of a weird thing about timeline variables. So up here we just got to say sound. But down here, we have to add this true parameter. And the reason is that we are writing this in a context where we want immediate access to the value of that variable. So up here, we're sort of setting this in as a placeholder. So this variable, we only want to be updated as the experiment is running. But this function here is going to be actually executing code during the experiment. This function here is running before the experiment even starts. So if it's running during the experiment and we need to have immediate access to the value of the variable, we have to add true for the immediate execution for the timeline variable. So if that right array contains, I think that is a valid thing that we can do in JavaScript now, contains the word, then we can say that this was in the right list. So let's see. If, okay, so that's the end of the if statement. So now we could say, let's see. How do we want to do this? We do var right word false, left word false, contains word, then we say right word equals true. And we can do the same thing for the left side. So just copy this and we will check the left. Contains the word. We say left word is true. Okay. And at the end of this loop, then we can actually modify this data for the trial right here. So we can say data.leftword correct equals left word. So it'll either be false or true. And data.right word correct equals right word. Okay, and that will run after every trial. So I'm going to save that. And I think that is all we need for that piece of it. So let's go ahead and try this out. Tub, maybe? Okay, I think I got an error. So if you get an error, developer tools are your best friend. So go to more tools, developer tools. Contains is not, okay, so that's not right. So how do we check if something is in an array in JavaScript? So let's make an array, ABC, XYZ. Includes ABC. True. False. Okay, so it's a dot includes, not contains. All right, let's launch this again.
Nev.
I don't know.
Jam.
Still don't know.
Van.
I don't know. I'll just guess.
Give.
Give?
Dog.
Dog for sure.
Ted.
Okay, I want to go see how this is working. So I'm going to pull up the console. I'm going to do jsPsych.data .get. I'm going to look at this in JSON format this time. Another way we can render. Oh, that's kind of a mess here because it's not pretty printed. All right, let's do CSV. So, okay. So we can see here's the file. It played mop and fan. I, for some reason, thought it said love. And my correct values were false and false. Here it was give and tap. Give was in the right ear. And you can see my left correct value is false, but my right correct value is true. And here I heard dog. So I put that in, and that was also true, and that was in the right ear. Well, I'm not using headphones, so it was just played, but that would have been the right ear. Okay. So great. Now we have some in our data. We actually have at least a first approximation of whether the subject heard the left and the right ear correctly. So the last thing in this experiment, besides some just fine tuning of the instructions, is that it's probably not a great idea to have the potential for the cat fall trial to be immediately after the fall cat trial. So I think we're going to split these up into two different blocks. So the simple way to do that is just to divide this up into two separate sets of timeline variables. I don't know why it wants to be there. So I'm going to call this block 1 and block 2. Okay. And then this audio trial and response trial don't need to change at all. But what we do need is this test procedure to be slightly different. So what we want to do is have a first block followed by a second block. We probably don't need a break in between those blocks. We just want them to be distinct in terms of randomization. So we can have this test procedure first half, and we can add that on. And then we can just copy this, and we can do test procedure second half. And so now we will have this. Now, right now they're using the same timeline variables. So one thing we probably should do is we should counterbalance across subjects which of the blocks comes first, block 1 or block 2. So we can do that in a couple different ways, but maybe a simple way to do it is to say create. Let's see. We could create an array that's the blocks. We could say timeline variables block 1, timeline variables block 2, and then we could do blocks equals, and then jsPsych has some built-in randomization things. So you can do randomization.shuffle, and this will just randomize an array. So here we've got one item in the array and another item in the array, and this will just randomize the order of those two. So now they'll be in a random order. And then here we can just say blocks 0, and we can say blocks 1. And this will ensure that on every load of the page, these are in a random order, and sometimes you'll get block 2 first, and sometimes you'll get block 1 first. And within each block, of course, the trials will be in a random order. All right, so I think the only thing left to do, I guess I should run this just to make sure I didn't make any mistakes with implementing that. And of course I did. So what did I do wrong? Let's check the errors. Cannot read property slice of undefined. Shuffle must be an array. What did I do? Oh, you have to pass in an argument to shuffle. You can't just call the function with nothing in it. Okay. Okay, good. So this seems like it worked okay.
Jam.
The experiment is loading and running. Great. So now the last thing to do here is just to fine tune the instructions a little bit. So instead of this welcome to the experiment generic instruction, what we'll do instead is, let's see. So let's see. We want people to use headphones. Please put headphones on and make sure that the correct what do we call these? Correct side is in each ear. And then we could, let's see, so we'll extend this string onto the next line. Your task is to listen to the audio and write down any words that you hear. If you hear more than one, actually we don't need to say that. I was going to add use a comma to separate them, but I think that instruction is in the yeah, please write down any words that you heard. If you heard more than one word, please separate each word with a comma. So that's already an instruction there. And I guess, so that's good there. We probably want some kind of trial that says that they're done. So let's, at the very end here, end screen. So we can, you know, we can just copy this. And we can say, okay, you are done. And actually, for this final screen, we really don't want a button to be an option that they can click. So let's because if they click the button, then it's just going to go to a blank page. So instead, let's load in the HTML keyboard response plugin, which allows us to do the same thing we did here, which is to have choices be no keys. And that way, this screen just becomes like the final screen of the experiment. There's nothing the subject could do other than close the page to end the screen. We have to change this to keyboard response. So you are done, and we will push this on to the timeline. All right, so let's give it a shot. I'm gonna get these on and do this for real. I'll probably fast forward this so you don't have to watch me sit through this whole experiment. But I will have the experiment available as a link in the YouTube video description and on the GitHub page, so you can try it yourself. I'm done. We're done. Hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and please leave any comments with questions that you need answered or suggestions about the next tutorial that I'll be making. Thanks.